Hurricane Sandy, which at one point became post-tropical storm Sandy, was not the most intense hurricane we've had, obviously, right? But it was one of the largest hurricanes on the Atlantic coast. In fact, Capital Weather Gang says that it was the largest hurricane in Atlantic history measured by diameter of gale force winds. So the amount of area that it covered was absolutely gigantic. And the reason they were calling it Frankenstorm initially is because you had the hurricane going to meet up with a nor'easter. It was 3 different fronts merging, and that's part of the reason why it was so gigantic. In fact, the National Weather Service said, "I cannot recall ever seeing a model forecast of such an expansive aerial wind field with values so high for so long a time. We are breaking new ground here." Now, the scientist who was saying that at the Weather Service is again talking about the size of it and the amount of time that it has been around and is going to continue to be around. So obviously it started on Monday, it's going to go into Tuesday, and then we'll see how long it lasts after there. We're talking about landfall, right? But when you look at the macro picture and you see a combination of all those records we broke in the summer in terms of highest temperatures ever, July hottest month ever recorded in history since we've obviously been recording things. During Hurricane Sandy, New York got hit with the highest waves already on Monday than they have had since 1821. And the list goes on. And when you look at the macro picture, you come away with the same conclusions as these scientists. So is climate change making these storms, for example, more severe? Well, of course it is. That's exactly what the model predicted. That's exactly what 98% of the scientists in the world told you would happen. Virtually all of us, now referring to climatologists across the world, are convinced that global warming poses a clear and present danger to civilization. The situation at hand is completely consistent with what I'd expect to see happen more often as a result of unabated warming, and especially the amplification of that warming in the Arctic. We are on track to see more than 5 times that warming this century, referring to what has already happened. The monster storms that would spawn are beyond imagining. And in fact, this climate change is literally hitting these reporters right in the face, as we're about to show you here, and they still don't get it. Here, watch.
And I can tell you the local authorities here in Ocean City are really worried about what's behind me.
We've been pounded for 40 continuous hours.
Now you can barely stand up.
And,
let's see her, guys.
Sorry, just getting pelted.
Okay, whoa. Whoa, hey guys. Whoa.
Oh my God. From, there's things flying off, actually, the roof here, but
Now, 100 miles out at sea, there are still those 2 survivors or 2 people missing in the surf.
But you look, I mean, this does not look good. Oh, excuse, it looks like the sandy walkway out to the beach. It's actually got my boots stuck.
Oh my gosh.
You can see not a pretty picture here in Delaware.
Oh, Peter, take it easy out there.
But I'm okay.
She signed up for this. This is what we live for here.
A long story short, the world is melting, and it's melting faster than we thought it was, unfortunately. So we have some interesting data in a couple of different areas. One of the most important is that global carbon dioxide emissions in 2011 hit record highs. So you see up 3.2%. Now, a lot of that is due to China. Actually, interestingly, America had, I think, 1.7% fewer emissions in 2011. Sea levels have been rising 60% faster than originally expected. Now, this is during the period of roughly about 1990 to 2010. So you see 60% faster, and that continues now. So we also have, let's see, why don't we go to this, the permafrost, because this is very interesting. So right now, in certain areas of the world in the north, there's permafrost, where organic material is frozen into the ground. And if that melts, it's going to release an insane amount of carbon dioxide. And the problem with that is that even if later on it was to refreeze, it doesn't bring the carbon dioxide back into the ground. And so that could help to accelerate some of the warming that we're seeing, some of the climate change that we're seeing.
Right.
The Mauna Loa Observatory, which is in Hawaii, has just reported atmospheric CO2 measurements of 400 parts per million. Now, this is a really big tipping point for a lot of atmospheric scientists. And really the reason they say that this is such kind of big news is more that it has a psychological impact on us. It's not that 400 parts per million is any different than 398 parts per million, but it was sort of a line in the sand that was drawn many, many years ago, and we've apparently crossed it, and it seems like the future is looking kind of bleak. We're already past the point of no return. Almost every climate scientist says that. The world has not been this warm since 3 to 5 million years ago. So to put that in perspective, anatomically modern humans have been around for 200,000 years. No human being has ever lived in this kind of an environment, and it's only going to get worse. But I do like that his energy secretary, like I said, Ernest Moniz, made a statement recently. Let me make it very clear that there is no ambiguity in terms of the scientific basis calling for a prudent response on climate change. And the reason that I think that this is important is because the House Science Committee has multiple climate deniers on it.
There are two camps of climate change deniers in America. The first being the ones who don't believe that climate change is happening, even in spite of the scientific consensus on the issue. And the other are the ones who say that it is happening, but that it's going to be a great thing for the world. The second camp is arguably worse for the planet, and I'm joined now by Desi Doyen, the co-host of the Green News Report, to tell us why the right-wing media is still trying to sell us on the idea that climate change is good for us. So, Desi, what's your take on that to begin with? I mean, climate change, how great is it going to be for this country?
Well, first of all, the scientific consensus is that climate change is real and it is a danger and we are causing it. And that's something that the right-wing media continues to cling to, I think because they really, really, really want us to keep using fossil fuels forever at any cost. You know, there's some new studies that have come out in just the last couple of years. One just came out yesterday that talks about how the melting of the Arctic is actually amplifying changes in the Arctic. And the Arctic is sort of like the air conditioner for the entire planet. It affects worldwide global patterns. And this new theory on the melting of Arctic sea ice implies that it's actually affecting global weather, affecting the jet stream, slowing it down, which is causing some of these really extreme weather events that we're seeing that hang out, causes a blocking pattern in the jet stream that causes these weather patterns, these weather systems to hang out and become even more severe. So it has really great negative implications for just about everybody.
Don't send those polecats back to Congress. Send them back to science class. It ain't easy being green, but it's better than the alternative. Today, let's track the ways we're being prevented from being eco-conscious and what we can do about it. Alex?
So here's the first way people are being prevented from being eco-conscious. Corporations are telling employees which candidates they must donate to. In September, the United States' largest independent coal company, Murray Energy, was slapped with a lawsuit by a former employee claiming she was illegally fired for refusing to give money to political candidates chosen by her boss who were all pro-coal. A Murray spokesperson told Think Progress that the claims were, quote, baseless, blatantly false, and totally concocted, deeming it an, quote, attempt to extort money from Murray Energy Corporation. But according to Open Secrets, Murray Energy and its subsidiaries have donated around $5,000 to each of the candidates mentioned in the lawsuit. Republican Senate candidates Scott Brown, Ed Gillespie, Terry Lynn Land, and Mike McFadden, plus an additional $2,600 to each candidate from CEO Robert Murray himself.
The U.S. Senate has voted overwhelmingly 98-1 to approve an amendment that affirms that climate change is real and not a hoax. And this was an amendment to legislation that aims to force the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline, which would, as I'm sure you've heard either from me or from others, would carry oil from the Canadian oil sands into the United States. Senators opposed to the pipeline, who say it would simply accelerate climate change, not create jobs, be bad for the environment, are using votes on the bill as an opportunity to sort of force Republican senators into admitting that climate change is not a hoax.
Larry King recently interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he had some really interesting things to say about climate change. Take a look.
Why isn't it raining in California?
Yeah, you know,
The climate is, I mean, drought. It's not as though droughts have no precedent in the history of the world. But what's more important than that it's not raining is there's a consumption of clean water, potable water from the water table that's not being replenished, and it's being pulled out at a faster rate than it's returning. And that's a recipe for disaster. And so we need to think more, sort of, dare I use the word, holistically about systems that manifest on this earth. And that's a relatively new way to think about the world.
But what do we do about it? Stumped, huh?
Yeah, I don't have easy answers. I think we need to be better shepherds of our activities and our behaviors. If you're watering your lawn, do you need clean, potable water to water your lawn? No. You could use the water that came out of your dishwasher. Your grass is not going to care. But we've set up a system that does not intelligently use even the limited water that's available.
Bigger question, why isn't it raining?
All I can tell you is that in the world, what we're going to find is more extremes of weather. Okay, when it rains, it's going to rain heavier. When it's not going to rain, it's going to rain less than it ever didn't rain before. And as these extreme, that's kind of the new normal we're going to have to grow accustomed to. And all evidence points to the fact that it is human-caused influence on the ecosystem.
According to the scientific journal Nature, we are currently in the 6th mass extinction event. This is terrifying. So the last mass extinction occurred 65 million years ago, and as you all know, it wiped out the dinosaurs. Now, species are going extinct 100 times faster than any other prior mass extinction event. Horrific. Scientists directly attribute this to human activities. Specifically, they cite the continuing spread of agriculture, which destroys wild habitats, obviously, the introduction of invasive species, pollution, overfishing. These are some of the things that they cite. They say that many species are threatened. 41% of all amphibians, 26% of mammals, and 13% of birds. Now, 1/3 of coral reefs are depleted. These support more life than any other ecosystem on the planet.
Huffington Post is reporting that some giant food corporations are beginning to panic over climate change. They say, quote, in a rebuff to climate deniers, the CEO of American food giant General Mills has asserted that global warming is being created by human activity and is threatening to disrupt global food supplies. So they go on to explain that over 10 years, he plans to cut company emissions 28%. And within 35 years, he wants to reduce 50% to 75%. And they make clear that they're not doing this because they want to do it. They're doing this because it's serious and they see a tremendous problem. They say, quote, a spokeswoman for the company went further, telling the Huffington Post that a failure to address climate change would make it extremely difficult to feed the world's growing population, which is expected to exceed 9 billion by 2050. She pointed to extreme weather and the decline in pollinating insects as worrying signs that are already impacting food production, and she noted that climate change will place stress on vulnerable growing regions around the world that provide important ingredients to make food. For example, 70% of the world's cocoa is sourced from 2 countries in West Africa, 90% of the world's vanilla is sourced from Madagascar, and 80% of the world's almonds are grown in California. So this is an incredibly important and an incredibly scary piece here, because what they're saying is, oh my God, even the big corporations are beginning to realize, if we don't do something, we're Fucksville. There's a new report out in the journal Nature on climate change, and it's devastating. So they say the following, quote, the gross domestic product of the United States was nearly $17.5 trillion in 2014. That's enough money to buy all the planet's gold 2 times over. But if the world's permafrost thaws, as a new study warns, humanity could be saddled with a bill that adds up to more than $43 trillion to the already massive climate-related debt the world will rack up in the next 2 centuries. So Kevin Schaefer, a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, called this, quote, an economic death sentence beyond comprehension.
Climate scientists have noticed a very disturbing trend when it comes to our oceans warming up and our coral reefs being bleached. Now, this is an event that's happened 3 times in history, and according to the reports, the ultimate result could be the loss of more than 12,000 square kilometers, or over 4,500 square miles of coral this year, with particularly strong impacts in Hawaii and other U.S. tropical regions, and potentially continuing into 2016.
Michael Mann is Distinguished Professor and Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University, and also author of 2 books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, and The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. It's so great to have you on.
Thanks. It's good to be on the show with you. So if we continue with business as usual, burning of fossil fuels, if we don't take precautionary actions to deal with our increased ongoing emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, we will likely see between 7 and 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the globe by the end of the century. Now, that won't, that doesn't mean that the entire U.S. will be submerged below the ocean. It means that there will likely be enough sea level rise to force us essentially to retreat from many of the major coastal cities of the U.S. and elsewhere around the world. It will mean that many of the problems we are already seeing, damaging impacts of climate change related increases in extreme weather, wildfires, droughts, flooding, all those things that we have seen already worsened weather events.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit, the COP21 here in Paris, France. Ahead of the talks, more than 180 nations pledged to voluntarily reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But many climate justice groups say far more needs to be done to keep global warming in check.
The message is that the voluntary submissions that have been put forward by all of the countries, when you add all of these up, they are far, far above the level of what we call dangerous climate change that all of our leaders have committed to avoid going above this 2 degrees C rise, I think about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But actually, when you add up all of the commitments that the countries are making in terms of their reductions in emissions, then actually it's far, far above that, near a 3 or 4 degrees C temperature rise, which is a huge increase. That's a global average. Remember, that is a global average, and most of the globe is covered in water. So on land, that's an average of if we carry on like we're going now, 4, 5, possibly even as high as 6 degrees C temperature rise.
So what does that look like on the ground?
If we saw those sorts of changes, we'd see dramatic reductions in the staple food crops. So that's a really big issue. Big 40% or so reductions in rice, maize, wheat, sorghum, those sorts of crops. Huge changes in sea level rise by the end of the century, but also locking in very large sea level rise changes going forward beyond that. We'd see increase in droughts and in flooding, increase in severity of typhoons in the southern hemisphere. So really, a lot of we've all learned to live with the weather that we've had. And actually what we've been seeing are significant increases in the extremes around the planet. So we'd all suffer very significantly from a 4 degree C temperature rise.
According to NASA and NOAA scientists, 2015 was the warmest year ever for global land and ocean surfaces, dating all the way back to 1880. And it's not just American scientists who are reporting that last year was the warmest on record. British scientists released figures showing 2015 as the warmest in a record dating to 1850. The Japanese Meteorological Agency had already released preliminary results showing 2015 as the warmest year in a record beginning in 1891. Keep in mind, 2014 had set the previous record for global surface temperatures, and 2015 just beat that record by a long shot. Part of what's going on has to do with an unusually warm Pacific Ocean due to an El Nino that's going on right now, but that doesn't explain it all. Calculated as Dr. Michael Mann explained to the New York Times, if the global climate were not warming, the odds of setting 2 back-to-back record years would be remote, about 1 chance in every 1,500 pair of years. Given the reality that the planet is warming, the odds become far higher, about 1 chance in 10, according to Dr. Mann's calculations. The really scary part, though, is that there's good evidence that this is nothing compared to what's to come. If we continue on this course, If we continue to spew methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in the pursuit of cheap and short-sighted economic growth, we can guarantee that our planet will continue to warm. And as the planet warms, the Arctic ice sheet will begin to rapidly melt, which means that up to 21 quadrillion grams of carbon, that is up to 400 billion tons of methane, would be released into the atmosphere. At that point, if humans are even still around, there would literally be nothing that we can do to stop a planetary mass extinction that would include making humanity extinct. More and more scientists agree that natural processes don't drive the climate anymore. Human activity does. And it's only human activity that can stop our march toward planetary extinction, which means we need to put a price on carbon. And we need to aggressively convert our energy systems to one that's 100% renewable. And we need to find carbon and methane neutral ways of transporting our goods, building our infrastructure, and constructing our cities. The technology to achieve all of these goals already exists. And we now face a choice as a global society. We will go extinct if we keep doing what's easy and what's comfortable. But we can save the planet if we make bold decisions and take immediate action to minimize human impact and thus restore the planet's own natural processes and the balance that existed for hundreds of thousands of years before the first human settlements.
Across the northern hemisphere in 2013 and early 2014, we have seen record low temperatures, some of them the coldest temperatures ever recorded in the last 300 years since thermometers were invented. The Great Lakes entirely froze over. The Arctic and Antarctic, in their respective winters, saw record growth in the ice. But what does Al Gore and CNN and MSNBC and the UN and the BBC do? They show you weather satellites from the poles during the summers and show the ice shrinking, as it's always done for thousands of years with the northern and southern passages that were even documented in the time of the Vikings. Why not tell school kids they're all going to die if we don't pay Al Gore and the UN trillions of dollars in carbon taxes? Well, now because they're losing the debate, and it's been shown in the UN's own numbers that since the mid-90s, the Earth's temperature has actually dropped slightly, that there are natural cycles, they can't deal with those facts. So, all over British and European news, but also here in the US, we've seen professors and others come out and call for the arrest of people that question anthropogenic or man-made global warming.
Now, this will be a different story.
And the latest is in the Times of London. With a straight face, one of the biggest papers in England talks about ministers and the committee in Parliament calling for people to not be allowed, including members of government, to question the, quote, consensus that man-made global warming is not man-made.
Americans love their SUVs, which spiked in sales last year as gas prices plummeted. How do you convince Americans that the problem of climate change is so urgent that they need to change their behavior?
I think we already are. Younger generation understands it instinctively. I was home in Burlington, Vermont on Christmas Eve. The temperature was 65 degrees. People in Vermont know what's going on. People who did ice fishing where their ice is no longer there on the lake understand what's going on. I'm on both the environmental and energy committees. The debate is over. Climate change is real. It is already causing major problems. And if we do not act boldly and decisively, a bad situation will become worse. It is amazing to me, and I think we'll have agreement on this up here, that we have a major party called the Republican Party that is so owned by the fossil fuel industry and their campaign contributions that they don't even have the courage, the decency to listen to the scientists.